2019 was a pretty interesting year for video games. From the quirky and innovative to the expertly executed, 2019 had it all. Obviously, I didn't get to play everything I wanted to, so I'll have to forego talking about certain games that I suspect I would have really enjoyed, and they probably would have made it to this list, but I simply just didn't get around to playing them yet. I do intend to play these games eventually, so I'll probably cover them eventually in some other form. So with that said, here is my totally subjective and somewhat pointless top 10 games of 2019. In my review of the Medieval remake, my opinion basically boiled down to the idea that while it should have gone much further with its improvements and enhancements, and even took a step back in a couple of weird ways, the game of Medieval is such a lovable, fantastic adventure that it has no problem retaining its charm from 20 years ago, while still benefiting greatly from the visual facelift provided by Other Ocean. Even today, the original Medieval is still one of my favorite games of all time, and in my opinion, it's one of the best adventure stories ever told. I do maintain that the game could have really soared much higher if Other Ocean went further with it, but to be fair, they did take a few opportunities to implement a couple of smart improvements over the original version, like the weapon quick switch mechanic from Medieval 2, and of course the Dan Cam, which has since launch been updated to also be a toggle if you want it to be. And those things don't go unnoticed. All in all, despite a few gripes that I do have with it, Medieval 2018 is as much a breath of fresh air now as it was back in 1998, and definitely deserves a spot on my list for that alone. There's just nothing else out there quite like Medieval. I was lucky enough to happen to be looking around Limited Run's website when I saw a physical version of River City Girls available for pre-order, so I reserved my own copy and got it a few months after the game launched, and I have to say I'm really impressed. Obviously, this game was made by the same folks that make the Shantae games, so I did expect a fun experience, but it still managed to exceed what I was expecting. River City Girls is, I guess, sort of a spiritual sequel or an alternative take on River City Ransom, and it follows suit with the game aesthetically and with its gameplay. It's just gender flipped, and I like how they did it. Putting these badass girl characters in a position to rescue their boyfriends is a nice change of pace for the retro formula, while honoring it with the same type of gameplay. Essentially, it's just a really fun, well put together beat 'em up game. As the game goes along, it mixes things up with some little side missions and additional objectives here and there that really help avoid a lot of the monotony that can set in with these types of games, and I really appreciate that. The music is also fantastic, and I can't praise Limited Run enough for making sure that this release included a physical soundtrack. It's got a good mix of retro video gamey style tunes and some early 2000s style punk rock music that I think fits the game really well. That way forward style of fun gameplay, great characters, and hilarious, sometimes self-aware writing is definitely here in spades. So if that sounds appealing to you for a beat-em-up style game, River City Girls is definitely worth a look.
I thought you guys were friends.
We were. A long time ago.
What's happening? It's a flashback. No one cares, Yamada!
If you've been following my channel for a while, you won't be surprised to learn that an Earth Defense Force game made it to the list. Iron Rain takes the most risks with the EDF format that the series has ever seen, and while I don't think it surpasses last year's excellent EDF 5, it definitely earns a spot alongside the other games in any fan's collection. Iron Rain just complements the franchise with an alternate take. Unlike the traditional EDF games, Iron Rain puts a little more emphasis on graphics, a more streamlined modern inventory management system, and a slightly darker tone, although make no mistake, it's still plenty goofy. In exchange for those modern details, you generally don't have as many enemies on screen as you might see in the older games, but not by much. It still very much feels like an EDF game. Of the various new ideas it brings to the series, a fairly deep character customizer and the ability to buy weapons at will instead of just waiting to pick them up randomly are among the most welcome ones. It straddles the line between innovating on and staying true to the character of the series quite well. If you like EDF games, this is an interesting diversion from the typical experience, but still delivers that feeling that only an EDF game can, while you're blowing away giant spiders, ants, and other unspeakables with conventional weapons and some less than conventional ones. Highly recommended. In my review of Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, I said that I liked the visual updates to the game, and it does well as a nostalgic-infused remake, but I wasn't really in love with how the 20-year-old track designs have aged regardless of having more polygons shoved into them. And I still feel that way. It's kind of the opposite situation of the Medieval remake. While Medieval holds up very well as an old experience despite the remake elements of it being kind of phoned in, CTR has all of the great remake elements that you would want, but the game underneath it has aged not so gracefully. That being said, CTR has seen lots of post-launch support from Beenox with new tracks, new characters, new modes, and it's been really nice to see that. With all of this attention the game has been given since launch, a relatively solid community has formed around the game's multiplayer, which itself has been drastically improved as well. The multiplayer works great now. If CTR launched in the state that it is in now, I would have definitely given it a higher score. It's just a better game than it was. I'm still not a huge fan of some of the track layouts and the fact that you're basically required to play as one type of racer if you want to have a prayer of succeeding in some of the later levels. But all in all, Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled is a good time, especially if you plan to mostly focus on online multiplayer. And even though many of the track layouts haven't aged well, what Beenox has done with them is often jaw-dropping. Definitely at least worth a try if you're a kart racing fan. Devil May Cry 5 is a game I never really expected us to get. With the way video games are going nowadays, I expected to get at least one more remake of the original DMC long before an actual 5th entry into the series. But I'm so glad we did get this because not only do I prefer new sequels and new iterations rather than remakes and remasters, but on top of that, DMC 5 is arguably the best Devil May Cry game ever with everything it brings to the table. Capcom made a great decision by allowing this game to happen. The RE engine that we've seen used in Resident Evil 7 and the remake of 2 shows its versatility here, as everything looks fantastic despite this being a very different type of game. DMC 5 is easily one of the best looking games of the year for this, if not of the entire generation. Just look at all this madness. Gameplay is very solid for a modern action game like you would probably expect, with tons of moves to learn and several different characters that all have their own distinct styles. I'm personally partial to Dante's flavor of insanity, but there's an argument to be made for all of them depending on your personal taste. There's so much to learn, in fact, it almost feels like too much at times, as I found myself forgetting movesets of previous characters by the time I was able to wrap my mind around new ones, but that's probably just me. DMC 5 is an action game for fans of action games. It doesn't try to convince any other type of player to enjoy it. Instead, it doubles down on those of us who already enjoy this type of thing. And you gotta give props for that. It's a 2019 game with the spirit of a game from 2002, and I mean that in the best way possible. 2019 was surprisingly light on Musou games, which is weird because for a while there it seemed like we were getting another Musou game every time we turned around, but thankfully we did get one of the best entries to the genre of all time with Fate ExTelelink. Like I said in my review of the game, I don't know much at all about the Fate series, and this game basically does nothing to bring newcomers up to speed, but the gameplay is top-notch and totally scratches that Musou itch in a way that no game has for me in a long time, probably since Samurai Warriors 4. The character roster is smaller than most other games like this, but I think what is here represents different playstyles well enough, and the expanded moveset from the last Fate ExTele game definitely makes this one the superior version. Zipping back and forth from different sectors of the map, accomplishing different goals, and earning various enhancements for your character, all while pulling off insane combos and elemental attacks and devastating screen clearing moves is an extremely addictive loop, and you'll easily sink several hours into it before you know what hit you. With so many games of this type popping up over the last few years, it really does say a lot for me to claim that this is one of the better ones, and I'm totally comfortable saying that it is. I definitely put it right up there with the best of them. It might not match Warriors Orochi 4 in terms of sheer content, but it certainly does in terms of quality and fun. Plus, the ultra colorful anime aesthetic brings a lot to the table for this game that those other games can't really touch stylistically. It's definitely one of the best Musou games I've ever played, and certainly one of the best action games of the year. Unlike CTR, Team Sonic Racing is a brand new game, and it benefits a lot from that. Where CTR falls short with its design and antiquated development philosophy, Team Sonic Racing largely excels in those areas. The tracks are a mix of some classics from the previous games and brand new ones, but they all feel like they fit since they were all designed within a decade of each other. This game is centered around Sonic exclusively, unlike its predecessors, which included the entire Sega universe. And ultimately, I think that was maybe a bit of a mistake. Having Gilius, Ryu, Sonic, and BD Joe racing together on tracks inspired by their games was a very special type of wacky that Team Sonic Racing just doesn't quite have. While the Sega universe feels nearly limitless with its characters and environments it can include, the Sonic universe feels a little bit stretched out here. Sure, there are enough characters in Sonic's universe to pad out a racing game, there's no question about that, but they're all so similar that the roster and the environments can't help but seem a little bit less interesting than what we had in the previous two games. Other than that though, Team Sonic Racing is an improvement on Sumo's previous entries in almost every way. The music, the graphics, the car modifications, and the racing itself is all as good, if not better, than it was in the previous two games. The racing in particular is the most objectively improved by being the tightest in the series. The drifting feels basically perfect, and the sense of speed is just right, as it can get noticeably more blistering than kart racers typically are. I was a little nervous about the team aspect maybe robbing me of my individual victories and making things too complicated to really enjoy, but thankfully I was totally wrong about that. If you can go into it with a slightly open mind, you'll see that it actually brings a nice twist to the kart racing format that it really needs at this point, while still respecting your own progress as an individual racer. But if you still don't care for any of that, there are classic modes on and offline that will give you that traditional racing experience. So I think they did a really good job managing new and old sensibilities here. This is hands down one of the best kart racers of all time. Death Stranding is one of the best games of 2019. Now, I understand that merely saying this out loud immediately labels you as a Kojima fanboy and a pretentious walking simulator aficionado, and you know, maybe I am a little bit of that, but to put Death Stranding in that category of games wouldn't be accurate anyway. It's not that passive. Death Stranding is actually anything but passive, as it has you micromanaging so many items and meters and percentages that you can and will easily get lost in an endless sea of operational maintenance before you know it. And this is where any given player will likely decide if they like or hate Death Stranding. The incremental moment-to-moment gameplay puts a very powerful microscope on seemingly basic concepts like walking and balancing and momentum in a way that makes them feel much more complex and rich with strategy. Deciding what to carry, planning your route, executing that traversal, all feed into each other, and the process rewards you for taking your time and making good decisions. Those decisions do get more and more complex as the terrain and your available equipment do as well. Slinking through the areas with BTs is also a nice twist that, while I think it wasn't explored quite as much as a concept as I would have liked, it does serve as a nice layer of horror and consequence over top of everything else, and also further adds to the satisfaction you feel when you get through everything and complete a very important delivery. The online functionality facilitates cooperation between separate players with building various structures and leaving equipment behind for others to find and use. It's all presented in sort of a social media format, and I think it provides some interesting and funny and pleasant surprises from time to time. Death Stranding's story is much like its gameplay. It takes very simple concepts and blows them up to show new layers of complexity. The ideas of connection, loss, and bravery are all main themes, but many shades of each are displayed by the characters characters in surprising ways, and it goes without saying that the overwhelmingly star-studded cast turns in outstanding performances across the board. The story's pacing itself will feel a little odd at first, as it can dump lots of exposition on the player at certain times, while also going long stretches of time with no meaningful developments at all. Normally, this could be a problem for a game, but here I feel like it's largely done on purpose. The long stretches of isolation are really instrumental to feeling the depth of Death Stranding's themes of loneliness and disconnection. Pursuing Sam's relentless and thankless work while small incremental rewards slowly pile up serves as not only one of the most engaging gameplay loops I've ever seen, but also doubles nicely as a nuanced examination of the morally gray areas that gig economy services like Amazon's 2-day shipping and Uber can create, all while the game slowly pulls you into a warm bath of super nerdy micromanagement goodness. While I think any reasonable fan of the game will admit it's pretty much only for players who dig this type of thing, and it does very little to placate those who don't, I also think that should elicit a little bit of respect from those who maybe it isn't even for. Personally, I don't think the value of a game solely lies in how many people it pleases. Obviously, there needs to be some level of mass appeal, but I always think the measure of a game is better judged by how well it accomplishes what it sets out to do. And to me, Death Stranding does seem to accomplish what it sets out to do. I will admit that, even as somebody who totally gets what Death Stranding is doing, it does drag a little bit from time to time, and the BTs do lose a lot of their eerie qualities before too long, so it doesn't always come together for me. It's the type of game you have to be in the mood for. But when I am in the mood for some slow, contemplative escapism, I can't think of anything better to play. The meditative core of the gameplay is what keeps me coming back, and it will undoubtedly continue to do so for a long time. It's not very often that games focus in on dark periods of human history with the gravity and sobriety that they deserve. A Plague Tale: Innocence aims to do just that by telling a thoughtful story about two siblings fleeing an English Inquisition invasion in 14th century France, only to come face to face with the Inquisitors themselves, as well as the plague and the millions of rats that are spreading it. Much like 2017's Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, Plague Tale takes its fair share of creative liberties with its historical setting, but largely still keeps a very grounded tone with it. It borrows a popular theme from games like The Last of Us and 2018's God of War that puts the main character in charge of protecting a younger, more vulnerable character, while that relationship deepens throughout the story. A Plague Tale might not pull off that particular narrative device quite as superbly as those other two games do, but it does get damn close. While the relationship between the two characters largely sticks to a predictable arc, the characters are written and performed so well that you likely won't mind. At its core, you could say this is a stealth game, but that's not really all there is to it. Amicia's slingshot can be used as a very deadly weapon if wielded carefully, and various forms of alchemy that she learns throughout the game can drastically tilt the table in your favor, deciding which enemies to pick off, who to sneak past, and how to deal with the oceans of plague-infested rats is an interesting internal debate that the game often prompts you to have, and I really enjoyed that, despite the game occasionally undercutting the gravity of those decisions by sometimes requiring a specific sequence of events to progress. Which leads me to the one thing that might bother some people: this game is ultra-linear most of the time, and it can trivialize its own inventory management system a bit by always making sure you're surrounded by plenty of items and materials that you might need to get through any given situation. Those things will probably feel a little constricting for fans of more open-ended games, but I personally don't mind this type of linearity as long as what I'm doing is satisfying and fun. And A Plague Tale has such a good sense of its own pacing that I feel it gets away with being as carefully orchestrated as it is. And to be fair, it does open up into some larger areas with more choices as it goes along. Those who do enjoy this type of thing are definitely going to love it. Its light RPG elements, visceral storytelling, intuitive gameplay, and excellent sense of its own pacing make it an extremely digestible and entertaining experience through and through. It expertly blends action, horror, and stealth into a period piece about finding solace amid devastation and recovering from heartbreaking loss. If you're the type of player who doesn't mind submitting to a little bit of slightly gratuitous structure here and there, I highly advise you to give this game a chance. Once you do make that trade-off with the game, you'll be in for a fiercely intimate tale that shows just how strong the bonds of family and friendship can be, even when tested by the most devastating tragedies known to humanity.
We need to hide!
No, we need to slow them down.
Control is a drop-dead classic, no doubt about it. I'm not exactly sure how Remedy was able to so effectively pull off this particular blend of action RPG gameplay, dark science fiction, and nebulous storytelling, but they did. What starts out as a seemingly normal action game steadily spirals out of control and ultimately becomes a tremendously unique dark superhero adventure into madness. Once you start to unlock some of the abilities and see the directions that the story takes, you'll start to really see Control's appeal. The various weapons and abilities at Jessie's disposal come together so well and feel so natural to use, while the various characters she meets and predicaments she faces have a disturbing way of lingering in your mind long after you've turned the game off. It's a similar vibe to Twin Peaks, as some characters are weirder than you would expect them to be, but still never quite go over the top. It's subtle. It's a very quiet kind of strange. The game would be great with just this tone and these characters, but it also arguably has the best action gameplay of anything else this year, with how the abilities add up to something very special. There are some gripes to be had though. Control crams most of its best moments into the optional side missions, which can screw up the pacing if you're the type of player who saves those until the end, like sometimes I do, or if you skip side missions altogether. On top of that, Control has a really crappy in-game map. It can get you the general idea of where you need to go most of the time, but it's just not as useful as it should be. Thankfully, the oldest house is set up like a real government building with lots of directions on the walls, so you can piece it together on your own, I guess. I just wish Control either fully committed to that or gave me a good map, but instead it does neither very well. Not a huge deal, but it's a legitimate complaint. What Control gets right, it gets very right. The mysterious characters and story on top of the incredibly visceral action consolidate into an outstanding experience that only the creators of Max Payne and Quantum Break could give us, and it ultimately surpasses both of those in my opinion. Despite it having a couple of head-scratching flaws, Control is an outstanding game overall. There's just nothing else like it. It's just as unique and interesting as it is fun and playable, and if you only play one game from 2019, make sure it's this one. So there you have it. If you're looking for some interesting experiences, look no further than the games on this list. With games like Last of Us Part 2 and Ghost of Tsushima coming up in 2020, I'm sure I'll have plenty to talk about when I do this countdown again next December. But until then, feel free to let me know where you differ or agree with me, and if there's something that I missed, for sure, definitely let me know in the comments below. But until then, thanks for watching.